Well, good morning. Thank you all so much for the opportunity to be here. I want to start, as we were coming in, Representative Dudgeon said he thought this might be his last official event as a representative, and I just want to take this opportunity to publicly say thank you. You have been such a breath of fresh air in so many ways, not only because of your incredible, unwavering commitment to kids and doing what's best for them, but just because of your honesty and integrity and your smarts. And it's really been a pleasure to work with you, and you will be incredibly missed. So
I will
thank
miss
you.
him as well.
So Kelly asked us to come this morning and talk about the work of Governor Deal's Education Reform Commission. As many of you know, this commission was formed. They worked for months to develop recommendations in a number of areas to improve education in our state. The governor chose not just to form a funding commission, though that in many ways has been the heart of the work of the Education Reform Commission and their recommendations. He really wanted the commission to take a comprehensive look at education and to create, to make recommendations that would create a system that prepares students for our 21st century economy. Representative Dudgeon served on that commission. I helped staff that commission, and there were a lot of great people who served, not only legislators, but educators, principals, school superintendents, teachers. There were business people and charter school leaders and individuals from the philanthropic community. So a really broad cross-section of education stakeholders in the state came together. And there were 5 individual committees. Funding was one of those. But the funding committee was given a very specific charge. So they weren't just tasked with developing a new formula or looking at the current formula and making recommendations on how to improve it. The very specific charge that they were given by Governor Deal was to make recommendations on how to move to a student-based funding formula. And so a formula that is driven by student needs and that allocates dollars to schools and districts based on the characteristics of the students who are being served in that district. Most of you in the room probably don't understand QBE, and the thing is that you're in very good company. There are lots of people that have worked in the legislature or in policy, even in education policy for years, that don't really understand the formula. And that is in large part because it is very complicated and it is antiquated. And it does a lot to box in school leaders and school districts into educating kids in a certain way, even when they don't necessarily think that that's the best way to serve kids. The formula, in the most simplistic way for you to understand it, it divides the school day into 6 segments. And for each of those 6 segments, for individual students, it looks at what is the class size for that student in that segment of the day. And when the class size is smaller, the formula allocates more dollars. And when the class size is larger, the formula allocates less dollars. And so that's the way in which the formula is driven, and you can see all sorts of problems from that just by that description. And instead, a student-based formula recognizes that students who have certain characteristics cost more to educate. But it also recognizes that there is no one-size-fits-all. There's no one way to educate kids. And so it gives those that are closest to students the flexibility to make the decisions about how best to educate them. I was on a panel last Friday talking about student-based formula, and I was on the panel with somebody from Nevada who had worked for Governor Sandoval, who has also moved towards a student-based funding formula, but they've done it in a little bit of a different way. And Dale, who was on the panel, said something, he gave this analogy about driving a car, and that they didn't fully want to give over the keys to school and district leaders and let them drive the car. Like, they still wanted to make sure that they were putting in the right gas, and they wanted to know where they were stopping. And I'd never thought about it this way, but when it came my turn, I said, well, I actually think we do want to give them the keys and let them go. We just want it to be very transparent what they're doing. And so this formula, while it has a tremendous amount of added flexibility, what will counter that and ensure that there is accountability is that it will also have a lot of additional transparency about the way in which dollars are spent, and it will do that in a way that makes sense to taxpayers, to parents, to community members, and so they can have a better understanding about the way in which dollars are spent.
Yeah, one thing I'll point out on the funding is a lot of the work of the committee, the subcommittee on the funding, was to make sure also that in a transition that there weren't a bunch of losers or there was hold harmless. Teachers have invested in the T&E, which is the existing system where they training and experience is what drives their salary. There was going to be basically where a teacher could not fall behind an existing teacher what they were making. If there was going to be certain districts when it comes to the old categorical grants for poor systems and things like that, to make sure again they would not be put in a bad situation. Because I understand you can't just switch a switch and change formulas 100%. It's too much of a shock to the system. So the committee did a lot of really good work to make sure not only we get to a student-based formula, but also during that transition period that there would not be a lot of systems who were all of a sudden looking upside down at budget things. And we have been in a rising budget environment, and the governor and the legislature the past several years have continued to add money back into education. So there's been more money per student every year for the past several years once the economy turned around. And that, I think, is an important thing to recognize too, that this is not trying to cut back funding, and there's a lot of misunderstandings about that. So I think that's a very important thing to say about the funding formula. I also say too, when I was on the school board in Forsyth County, my first couple of years before the economy collapsed in 2007 and 8, and I remember sitting there in the board meetings as we were trying to wrestle with how to take the QBE requirements and smash them into a fast-growing system. And this school had this many needs, but the QBE formula said you need 0.01 counselors and 0.03 assistant principals and this class schedule. The QBE formula is a factory model of education where it's a formula where everything's exactly the same in every school in every state, every county, and that's just silly. And to have that funding formula today is just crazy, and we're willing to move beyond it.
That's right. Just to give you an example of the way in which the formula dictates how kids are served, there is a count day in October and a count day in March. And so on those count days, that's where we see where students are during those 6 segments of the day. We have a local school district that serves a very large percentage of students who are English language learners. And that district would like to bring students in during the summer and provide very intense language support for the students during the summer. And the district believes that if they did that, that students would be in a very good position to go into the normal classes during the school year. This sounds like a good idea, right? But they can't do that right now, because if they're not providing that service on the count day in October and the count day in March, then they don't earn any funding for those students. Switching to a student-based formula, you would allocate additional dollars to that district because they're serving students who are English language learners, and then you would allow the district to make decisions about when is best to serve those students and the best way in which to serve those students.
Yeah, the new student formula, for the first time, very explicitly has a weighting factor for the English language learners, but also for the kids from the economically disadvantaged. That's kind of indirectly done with QBE, but this makes it much more direct accounting for that those economically disadvantaged kids do take more money to educate. So this policy would very firmly recognize, a lot of people in public education have been saying for a long time, is that the kids, even with the same grade and so forth, depending on their backgrounds, are going to cost a little bit more money to educate.
That's right. And the way the formula works today, students in the early grades that need remediation qualify for a program that's called the Early Intervention Program. And so if you're providing that remediation with this specific program that was developed in 1985, so maybe not the most innovative program for serving students, then you earn those dollars. This formula shifts, and it's a philosophical shift. Instead of only allowing districts to earn more money when students haven't met the standards, so you're really giving additional money when students haven't reached the benchmarks that you believe they should have met. Instead, it gives those dollars on the front end, recognizing that students who are economically disadvantaged are going to need more support in the early grades. Very focused on trying to get them on grade level by the completion of 3rd grade so that they don't need any additional remediation or support beyond that. But it gives the flexibility, again, at the local school and district level to determine how to use those dollars.
I think I'll talk about something related, which is teacher compensation, which kind of flows out of that. The goal of the funding of the Reform Commission's recommendation was that we empower local school systems to develop a compensation model for their teachers that fits what they need for their systems. Again, the state can have a model that's universal for every single system and to say that Forsyth County needs are the same thing as Houston County needs, or the same thing as Raven County. I don't know what their needs are. I don't know that the teacher recruitment and the plan needs to be the same. So the idea is that in the very rigid salary schedule we have now at the state, we wanted the local systems, with guidance from the state, to develop a compensation model that's a little bit more rich than what we have today, which basically the two axes are how many years you've been working and what degrees do you have, and take more things into account, like how much responsibility do you have in the classroom. Are you a grade leader? Are you teaching in a very challenging school? And to take those kind of responsibilities and those kind of things in the classroom, or are you teaching an AP subject versus teaching driver's ed? It's harder to get AP teachers. Why can we not have a compensation model to reflect just things that any sort of, most every other organization is going to reflect in their compensation? But again, the idea is that the locals would develop these models with total flexibility, because they have the funding is not tying them into these old segmented models. At the same time, with respect to any teacher who's been hired under the old model with the T&E, we're going to make sure that those people stay true to sort of the contract they believe their compensation will be on. And that's another thing that came out. Another thing I will point out is that the press made a big deal out of pay for performance, and this Reform Commission is not about pay for performance. That was one sentence in a 90-page report. We're saying the local school system could include performance metrics as part of their compensation if they wanted to, but it got blown out of proportion, unfortunately, in the media.
I know you're all really surprised by that. So that's funding. Those are the basics of funding. We can answer any other questions you might have about funding. So that's one of the 5 committees. The next committee was focused on teachers, and it was the Teacher Recruitment, Retention, and Compensation Committee. This committee also focused a lot on teacher morale. It's an issue that a number of educators across the state and those who are focused on education issues, an issue of which they're concerned right now. This committee was chaired by a previous State Teacher of the Year, Pam Williams, and Mike served on this committee. So Mike, I'll let you talk about this one.
That's a great committee, and we actually spent the first few months going around the state talking to large groups of teachers to find out what's important. It was very interesting, and you find this a lot of the other employee surveys. I mean, money is important, but their work environment is always number one. And a lot of teachers feel that they've been asked to do too much, and they wanted us to sort of back off on new requirements, on new curriculum, on new intrusions into their planning time, so they could just focus on teaching. And that was heard loud and clear. One of our recommendations was that the legislature and the state refrain from doing anything that's going to add more administrative burden to teachers. Another recommendation was to make sure that we're not changing our curriculum too often, because again, if you change the curriculum too often, the teachers feel they never can catch up, just to let them, give them some space to teach. We also looked at some specific things around how to make sure that our teacher recruitment programs were good. Right now, the student teaching model is a single semester. The clinical practice, more like what you do with nurses and with doctors, to have a full year. But also the recommendation is that we should end up finding some funding in order to reimburse teachers who take in these student teachers. That's extra work for them to have a student teacher in their class. And we want to make sure that we incentivize the good teachers to take these students and to teach them. Because what we found is, just like any other occupation, the better you do in induction, the better you do at training these new teachers, the more likely they're going to want to stay and more likely they're going to succeed in the classroom. And so those were kind of the 2 biggest areas we looked at in the teacher focus. There was some smaller things about maybe doing a service cancelable loan to sort of encourage more people in the profession. If you look at it, the number of current enrollees in education school in Georgia, all the university system, compared to like 7 or 8 years ago, it's down like 20-ish%. I don't remember the exact numbers. There's less people getting into teachers, and I think part of it is there's a feeling that teaching has got the bad rap as a difficult because of all the sort of things that have gone on with the changes and all the stress in the teaching area. So, I mean, obviously compensation is important, but we're trying to make that work environment better.
That's right.
Yeah.
And once the Education Reform Commission had finished their work, Governor Deal formed a teacher advisory committee to look at the recommendations of the Education Reform Commission and to advise him on what would be important from a teacher's perspective for him to consider, assuming he moves forward with the funding formula recommendations, with the recommendations of the committee that we just discussed, and with the recommendations from the Move On When Ready committee, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And that teacher advisory committee was made up of 90 teachers from across the state. 30 teachers from the metro area, 30 from North Georgia, and 30 from Middle and South Georgia. And those teachers, 10 of them in each of those regions taught in elementary, 10 in middle, 10 in high school, and they had varying degrees of experience and taught across all subject areas and grades in those schools. And one of the major things that came out, I know it came out in the committee's work as well, is the issue of planning time and protecting planning time. And frankly, this is an issue that's not really easy to address at the state level because you're getting way into local decision making to get into an issue like planning time. But it's certainly an issue that came out in all those venues, that teachers very often, their planning time is taken away for doing various things, often that they don't see as being beneficial for students. And obviously, if we expect teachers to go into the classroom and prepare engaging lessons every day where they're differentiating instruction based on the needs of learners in their classroom, they're going to need some planning time to do that. So that's a big one that local leaders are going to have to figure out a better way of protecting that time.
I will say that Chairman Coleman and I in the Education Committee took it as sort of an informal suggestion that we looked at every legislation with the eye of, is this going to put more burden on our teachers? And we actually turned down a whole heck of a lot of legislation. It's very, very easy for legislators to get their pet idea and have a bill about something in schools because there are a lot of ideas. Everybody has their ideas about how to do stuff in schools, but I think if the legislature and the state board sort of make sure that they look through that lens and the local leaders look through that lens, then hopefully we can move the needle on that.
So the third committee was focused on move on when ready, and that's a term we've used in the state for a long time. It's meant various things. Usually that term refers to students in high school who are allowed to enroll in post-secondary institutions and earn dual credit for the courses that they take. What the governor really meant this term more broadly in the Education Reform Commission context, and it's more focused on making the entire system student-driven and a focus on competency-based education. So we've always thought of education for hundreds of years as, you're 6 years old, so you're being taught first grade standards, regardless of whether you can perform at a 5th grade level on math or if you need additional support in reading. And the focus of this committee was, how do we make that system more nimble? How do we make it more student-focused? How do we support teachers in doing that? Because that's not easy. It's difficult to have a class of 25 students and to have all those students at different levels and be teaching different standards. The recommendations out of this committee range from things like provide flexible testing windows so that students have an opportunity to show that they are competent and proficient, rather than just waiting until the end of the year for that one opportunity, to graduating more students, not only with post-secondary credit, but also with job-ready credentials. And so that's something I think you'll see some movement on in the future. Anything you want to add on?
I'll just say that to me, my favorite recommendation in this whole package, because it's sort of a little bit below the radar, but I think it's where we're going. I know Kelly and the foundation here are huge believers in this. Again, getting rid of the factory model of every 3rd grade class is going through the exact same curriculum, exact same thing, or just the next level that I have the advanced and the regular and the behind 3rd graders. To tailor that to saying, what is the competencies you need to learn, and breaking it up so that it's at a student level and not at a grade level. With technology now, especially with things in the older grades of blended learning, the technology and the systems are doing that are there now. And providing a path and some grant funding and some innovation in order to move schools. It's hard. It's changing a decades-old model. But there are schools, Henry County I think is doing some good job, or doing piloting how you would actually do this competency-based education. To me, that's a great recommendation here. And if I'll say 20 years, but if some number of years from now we're not doing it that way, we're still doing the sort of linear factory model, then we should all be ashamed of ourselves.
Agreed. The 4th committee was focused on early learning. So with a strong belief that students, we know about the word gap for students who come from low-income families and the impact that has once they enter school. And so this committee was specifically focused on ensuring that all kids in the state have access to high-quality early learning opportunities, and particularly to pre-K. Again, the recommendations ranged, and some of these have already been acted on. One of those was to create pay parity between pre-K teachers and our K through 12 teachers. We have had very significant issues with turnover of our pre-K teachers. They were not on equal pay scale. And so when an opportunity came available in the K-5 school, they usually hopped into that, and it created a lot of turnover issues. So this is, I think, going to do a lot to help on the recruitment side for pre-K teachers, and certainly to keep them in the classroom longer. There were recommendations regarding tax credits that would be both for those who are operating child care centers as well as for parents, opening up more opportunities for them to access high-quality opportunities. So wide-ranging recommendations there in the early learning space. And then the last committee was charged with expanding educational options for students in Georgia, with a particular focus on expanding educational options for those families who currently do not have options, and those are typically low-income families. Many of those families, their children are currently zoned to attend chronically failing schools, and so a particular focus on giving those children and their families educational opportunity. The recommendations from this committee, many of them were focused on charters and creating equitable funding and equitable facilities access for charter schools in the state. There were recommendations around the existing student scholarship tax credit program and creating more transparency. Also in moving, one of these has already been acted on by the Department of Revenue, but it was moving the date. Many of you, I'm sure, are contributors to this program. And as you know, it hits the limit every day on the first day, and that has been New Year's Day. And so it's moving it to a day that is not a holiday, and the Department of Revenue has already acted on that one. There were only two recommendations that came out of a committee that did not make it past the full Education Reform Commission recommendations, and one of those was to create a low-income tax credit program. And Mike, I know you're going to have some, things to say about that. And so, Mike, I don't know if you want to add anything in this space, or particularly about that effort.
Sure. I mean, that recommendation, I think we failed by one vote in the full committee, and it was frustrating to me, and there was still a lot of momentum for it, so we tried. I sponsored a bill to do that. We have the regular goal or the regular SSO scholarship. This is actually area where I'm not sure we're in agreement with the public policy foundation. That's a good thing. We're not always in agreement. But you have a whole class of kids where they have no other path to getting out of their failing school. And to me, to set aside a scholarship organization, which does the same thing we have globally for the low-income kids, is fine. And also, by having it restricted to low-income, you actually open up a lot more corporate donations who will donate to something that's restricted by income and won't do it to something that's open to everybody. We gave it a run. I think it's an idea that will hopefully continue to go out. And the bottom line is, how do we provide, we need to do a better job in Georgia providing alternatives to our low-income kids who can't afford to go to a private school, even if their local school is failing. So that's important. On the charter side, I just spent 6 months being a board member of a startup charter school in Fulton County, and I got to see some of the stuff I've done in policy live and in color, and realize the challenges of starting a school and facilities, even in well-funded Fulton County. And here's the bottom line. I did a lot of work on charter legislation. I was there. Charter schools are part of the policy of Georgia. We have successful charter schools in Georgia. Of course, we have some that aren't successful, but that's the way it works. There's some things work and some things don't, but it's a big part of our policy. It's a big thing that's helping in Georgia. We need to get rid of all these nickel and dime things in the code, which are treating charter schools as second-class citizens. They're part of the landscape, and you just need to clean house, and that's basically what they tried to do. I've said many of the things in the recommendations I've also tried to do legislatively over the years, only to be thwarted by other folks in the General Assembly. But hopefully we can get them in the reform final version and do that. Again, none of these things are major things, but they're all these small nickel and dime cut things that just make a charter schools board life just more difficult, and we just don't need to do that.
Kelly, I know you want to open this up for questions, so we're ready.
All right. First one I've got here is the impact of the Amendment 1, the Opportunity School District.
Somehow I knew that'd come up today.
Did not pass, and does that, what's the impact of that on the current legislative session and these recommendations?
I mean, that solution to a real problem that we have in the state, and to addressing the complete lack of educational opportunity for tens of thousands of kids in the state didn't work. That wasn't the solution. But the problem still exists, and it's incumbent upon all of us to figure out what the solution is. Certainly from the governor's standpoint, everything's on the table. And we'll be working with the General Assembly to craft what that solution is. So look forward to new solutions to address that problem.
I'm hoping it's not as apocalyptic as either the media or just the sense out there is that they're connected in some ways. It's about education, obviously, was a major initiative, but the stuff we've talked about here in the Reform Commission is not really related to the OSD, and a lot of what we're saying should not be controversial. It should be nonpartisan. It should be, we just need to do things better for our public education kids. And so I'm hoping that with the right messaging and the right approach, that no one would look at the fact that, oh, well, we turned out OSD, therefore we can't fix all these other things, again, a lot of which are non-controversial. I'm hoping that it won't be as big of a drag as maybe some people think it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think many of the recommendations of the Education Reform Commission improve the overall education landscape, which of course serves all kids and would provide greater opportunity. And certainly equitable funding for charter schools is a really big one. Right now you would have more charter schools going into communities where kids currently lack educational opportunity and probably serving kids much better than they're currently being served. But they can't do that, particularly in areas like Atlanta, because there's such a funding disparity.
Yeah.
All right, the money question is, literally the money question. How much more money do we anticipate are we going to be spending if we get these reforms? How much money is state dollars going to be going down to local systems? What's the change in funding?
So in the last legislative session, Governor Deal recommended and the General Assembly approved adding $300 million additional dollars. Over the time that Governor Deal has been in office, a larger percentage of the state budget has been allocated to K-12 education for any governor and General Assembly in the last 50 years. So there's really no question where priorities are. The overall recommendation of the Education Reform Commission would be to add another $167 million, I think, is the number. And so if that recommendation sticks and is in the recommendation, it would be somewhere in that ballpark.
I do want to point out that there's two sides of this. There's the size of the overall pot of money, which we want to increase and the recognition increase. But also, once you have that pot, what's the right way to allocate that pot of money? And again, that's a little bit separate than the amount of money you want.
Well, and it's a really big issue, and it's why the recommendations of the funding committee are so important.
That's right.
You can look across the state and across the country, and there are lots of states and schools and districts that are spending more money, and they're not getting results that are nearly as good. And so it's not just money. I mean, if you look across the country over the last 40 years, education funding has increased by 185%. Results have not. Look at our performance on PISA and NAEP. Look at how American students are faring compared to students internationally. And so it's not more money. It's the way in which those dollars are spent. It's opening up so that there's greater competition and greater options for families. So that's really important. And we believe those decisions about how dollars are spent are best made by those who are closest to students.
This is a good follow-up to that question. What considerations were made, I guess, on the funding formula regarding student health, behavioral, physical, dental, any of those, I guess, wraparound services that people have talked about? Is any of that incorporated in the recommendations?
It is not incorporated in the recommendations in that there's not, the formula doesn't work that way. So the formula doesn't allocate dollars for specific services. The formula allocates dollars based on the characteristics of students and then allows decisions regarding the services provided to those students to be made at the local level. But again, for the first time ever, the Education Reform Commission recommended allocating dollars for economically disadvantaged students. And then it would be the decision of those at the school and district level to determine how best to support those
So
students.
if you were a disadvantaged English language and you had a disability, that's going to give more weighting. So you're going to have a lot more money as a local district, but we're not going to tell you exactly which services from the top down.
And one thing I will point out is right now there is almost no ability to, if you're a local school district leader or school leader and you're trying to see what other schools across the state are serving kids like the kids in my school and doing that really well, there's very little ability to do that. And one of the things that this new formula combined with the transparency is that it would allow you to do that. It would allow you to see, wow, that they're serving a large percentage of English language learners and their performance is outstanding. What are they doing? And hopefully will result in more of those best practices being replicated.
two school choice questions. I'm going to combine them. One is, Georgia taxpayers are paying for the car. When are we going to give parents the keys to the car? And a related
Not
one
soon
is that
enough.
you mentioned Nevada. They passed a universal education savings account. Why shouldn't we look at them as a model to move forward in Georgia?
Well, I've tried. I can say during my years in the legislature, I've tried to move the ball on these things. I was the second signer on the savings account bill. I worked on this SSO bill. Been in favor of almost all the school choice things, but at the same time, I've been what I would call a fierce advocate for public education, making sure that we're funding them appropriately and making sure we're doing the right things to help the regular public schools. To me, I don't see it as a binary choice. But unfortunately, the argument framed by a lot of the public school establishment people, and even some of my things in the legislature, is that it's a binary choice. Either you're 100% for public schools only and everything else is bad, or you're 100% on a school choice thing and therefore you don't like the public schools. So, because I think that's a false dichotomy that's been put out there by people, but it makes it very hard to do, because anytime you start talking about things like SSOs or education savings account, the argument is always, well, you're going to take money away from the public schools, you're going to do this, you're going to do that, and therefore it makes it politically very difficult, especially in Georgia. We have so many school systems because of our counties, and the fact we have almost 200 independent school systems makes it difficult to politically.
Yeah, and I mean, I think our focus should not, as Mike said, this is certainly not a binary issue, and our focus should be on serving all kids well and providing all kids with educational opportunity. And, this is so much of the part of the American dream. I mean, we believe that you should be given equal opportunity, and it's up to you to make of it what you will. And for far too many kids in this state, you're never getting that chance.
Here's what I will say, and it's easier to say this since I'm leaving the legislature. For this to really work in Georgia, Governor Deal has been good at working on this, on school choice, but we're going to need the next governor to be very vocal about wanting to do that as a platform in order to be able to push it again with renewed energy here in a couple of years.
This is
So
a good
evaluate
point.
that when you're looking for your governor.
This person says they have good friends graduating in May 17 from Georgia Tech Mechanical Engineering, starting salary of $99,000 and a $10,000 signing bonus. How can we compete in trying to attract teachers? And I know that's maybe math and science. I know you've got nurses that are making a huge amount of money. It's hard to get good chemistry and physics teachers because if they have a science degree, they can make a lot more money. How do we keep the best and brightest in the classroom?
Well, I mean, you've got to start with moving away from the existing salary structure.
That's right.
So the existing salary structure starts all teachers at $33,000, and the only way that teachers earn additional dollars is to be in that classroom additional years or to earn additional advanced degrees, most of which are not correlated with improvements in performance and with student achievement. So you have to move away from that. And what we said today is the recommendations here are to give local districts flexibility. So they're earning dollars based on the characteristics of their students, but then they're allowed to design their compensation system. So if that old T&E model is serving them well, stick with it. But if they want the ability to attract outstanding performers and they want the ability to attract a Georgia Tech grad, then they're going to have flexibility in that compensation.
Yeah, because realistically, you're never going to compete with the science and technology salaries of the private sector. But one thing in the teacher committee that came out, if you make that environment better, if you make it so that those young people who are more, I'll say, idealistic and they're willing to do something at less salary because they have a passion for it, because they want to give back. If you give them a better student training, if you give them better induction, you give them better support in those first few years, then maybe you'll get more people to stick around and take the less salary. At the same time, you should be able to pay the Georgia Tech mechanical engineer who's going to go in and teach some high-end science courses, should be able to pay them more right out of the gate.
I mean, teaching is I can say personally, an incredibly rewarding profession. There is nothing like teaching and watching that light bulb come on for students and having that impact on them and supporting them and mentoring them. And so for a lot of people, they're just not going to find the fulfillment and satisfaction in other careers that they're going to find in teaching. And so you have a competitive advantage just for those who are looking to be able to have that impact on young people. But the salaries do need to be more competitive, but you have to free up that salary schedule to be able to
And
do
like
that.
you said, working conditions. I know a lot of teachers will accept a lot less money to go teach in a private school
That's right.
than public schools.
Exactly.
Who's opposing the funding formula changes? And what are the arguments? I mean, I guess other than people who want to spend more money,
Sure.
what are the other opposition?
So I can tell you that we have met with superintendents all across the state, from all types of districts, small, large, medium, rural, urban, and we haven't met with a single superintendent who has said that this is not, they all believe that this is a better formula, this is a better way of allocating dollars. And the recommendation, there are no losers in the formula. So typically, anytime you're moving from one formula to another, the way I explain it to people is if I had $100 and I was gonna allocate it to the people in this room, and historically we've been allocating it based on height, and we decide that we're instead gonna allocate it based on hair color, then, you know, somebody wins and somebody loses in that. And just because of the fact that you're changing from height to hair color. And it's the same with changing any education formula. Just when you change the way in which you've been allocating those dollars, it creates winners and losers. But the recommendation out of the Education Reform Commission, very few districts were getting any less money at all, and the recommendation is to hold those few districts harmless for 3 years. But I think the total hold harmless was $2 million, which is unheard of.
They did a great job. It took many months to actually craft the formula. They wouldn't even need sort of the budget trick of a hold harmless with just a very small number. And that's why it took all year, and it took a ton of detailed math and detailed work in order to get that right.
Trying to read the writing on some of these. What is this? I'm one to complain. What is the state doing to partner businesses with schools? I know, you know, this has been an age-old effort, and we had a charter school, we had a lot of business people, and business people just get so frustrated, and they don't understand a lot of the challenges of education, and education people don't understand some of the business operations, and it's been very frustrating. Have you seen any good models of businesses working with schools?
I can give a small example. I was fortunate to work at the suggestion of the governor on an initiative to get more computer science teaching going on in education. And so I brought a couple of business people I knew from the computer science world into the committee form that actually looked at the curriculum, helped review it, to help like saying, yeah, we should be teaching this, not be teaching that. I know some other states, and I hope Georgia's using this model, are doing some sort of guest teaching models where you're bringing in a teacher from industry to like teach with a co-teacher in the classroom these hard sort of courses like computer science. I know Washington State, I talked to the state legislature from there a year or so ago, doing a great job with that. We're starting seeing some. I know Northview High School in my district does a decent amount of that with their charter system flexibility. So I think encouraging getting, especially in the high school level, getting business people involved in the curriculum has been important. I know the career academies, the lieutenant governor has championed and done a lot there, where you're getting a lot of business people working again on the curriculum and stuff there. Business leaders are supposed to be in all the local school councils, so I don't know, am I missing something there?
No, I think that's right. The other thing I would add, in the Move On with Ready committee, they recommended more students graduating from high school with industry certification.
Right.
But the way in which that's ultimately structured will be very important,
Right.
and that has to be driven by businesses. It has that you have to do an annual review of that, an annual pruning, to ensure that you're preparing students for the jobs that are available and for the industries that are available. And particularly, you know, there's probably going to be some regional difference in that. So that'll be an important place for business to engage. It'll likely be tied to the High Demand Career Initiative and the work of the state workforce efforts.
Well, that'll have to be our last word. It's at 9:15, and I want to thank our speakers for coming here. We have a copy of Larry Reed's book, and thank you so much for coming. Hope to see you all January 26th. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.